This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 924 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's Sleeper Show results, they weren't terrible, but they weren't great. Romeo Doubs didn't even end up playing, and we all know how Dontavian Wicks' week went. Deshaun Watson was pathetic in a plus matchup, and that resulted in a poor Jerry Jeudy game. Gabe Davis and Emmanuel Wilson did nothing too. But Trevor Lawrence had a good game against the Colts, and Joe Flacco had a good game against the Jags. Trey Sermon was fine, Wan'Dale Robinson had a good game, Keon Coleman thankfully caught a long one, Josh Downs was solid, Roschon Johnson scored twice, and Tucker Kraft had a monster day. So overall, like I said, definitely not terrible. Now, before we get to this week's sleepers, I want to remind you about Underdog. Underdog is the best place to play fantasy sports. You can play Pick'em in Champions mode, or if you're like me, you can join some snake drafts for each week's slate of games. During October, Underdog's running a different promo every single day with Boosttober. You can take advantage of those promos by signing up today. And if you sign up, you'll also get access to my rest of season rankings, which are updated in season every Tuesday. All you have to do is head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. Sign up, and when you do, use promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you access to the promos, a deposit bonus, and again, my rest of season rankings. I'm telling you, Underdog is so much fun. Check it out now with promo code LATEROUND. This first tier includes players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues who you might want to start this week. We've got a lot of injuries. We got a lot of bye weeks. You may need some help. At quarterback, I really like Daniel Jones. I mentioned him on the 15 Transaction Show earlier this week because he's been playing really well. He's hit 18 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4. He's 5th in the NFL in quarterback rushes. And he gets a Bengals defense that's been the 5th most desirable matchup for quarterbacks this year. The Giants actually have the 11th best implied team total on this week's slate. Sportsbooks know that this Bengals defense has been struggling. That makes him a fun play this week. You could also look at Andy Dalton in this tier. He's rostered in just over 10% of leagues. And while I don't feel as good about him as I do Danny Dimes, I do think he's okay as a streamer. Just okay. The Panthers get the Falcons in the game with a decent 47.5 point over-under. And the Falcons have been an above-average matchup for quarterbacks this year. Now, I know Andy Dalton wasn't great last week, but he also played the Bears. The Bears have been the toughest matchup for quarterbacks this season. This one's a little bit better, so he could come away with a score or two. Now, Jonathan Taylor didn't practice on Wednesday, so he might be out again this week. If he is, then we should expect a combination of Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson once again. Sermon is the preferred choice here, but keep in mind, he's also banged up. In week 5, though, Sermon had the snap share advantage. He handled more work on the ground, too. Goodson, though, did run more routes, even if Sermon had a better target share. According to Fantasy Life data, they split long down and distance snaps. Basically, what I'm getting at is that this is a split backfield with Trey Sermon basically being the 1A in that backfield, as long as he's healthy. But the matchup's kind of mid. Tennessee's been below average for running backs this year in adjusted points allowed. However, they do rank 3rd in adjusted target share allowed. That could elevate the floors for both of these players in PPR formats. Ramondre Stevenson is banged up right now, and at this moment, no one knows if he's going to play this weekend. Obviously, that means that Antonio Gibson could then see a big workload. Here's the thing, though. Houston's been a really tough matchup for running backs this year. They've allowed the 2nd fewest adjusted points on the season to the position. And they're actually a top 2 team in adjusted target share allowed to the position. In a bad way. So Gibson works strictly on volume. But do keep in mind that the matchup is not ideal. Now, on the flip side, you have Tyler Algier, who may not see a ton of volume, but the Falcons get the Panthers this week. And the Panthers have not been great against running backs. They've been fine on a per rush basis, mostly average in yards over expected allowed per rush and EPA allowed per rush. But teams are running the ball against them, which isn't that surprising. This defense, the Carolina Panthers defense, has faced the 2nd lowest pass rate against them this season. That's largely due to game script and matchup. That's great, though, for someone like Tyler Algier. The Falcons are 6-point favorites, and Algier has averaged a 43% running back rush share over his last 2. He should be fine. That logic is pretty similar for Roschon Johnson, too. He was able to take advantage of that Carolina matchup last week. He's consistently been seeing running back rush share rates of about 31% over his last 3 games. And he's seen 4 goal line attempts during this stretch. DeAndre Swift has seen 5, but Swift has only scored once on those 5. Roschon Johnson has scored 3 times. Swift has -7 yards on those attempts. Johnson has 4. Johnson has been the better goal line back. And this is something that we've seen with DeAndre Swift throughout his career. He's not a great back at the goal line. So we might see that again this week because the Bears get the Jags. The Jags have been really bad against the pass, but they've also been bad against the run. They've surrendered the 3rd most adjusted fantasy points to the running back position. So I think you could do worse than Roschon Johnson this week. Now, a wide receiver, Josh Downs, for whatever reason, he's still below the 50% rostered mark over on Yahoo. Downs has now seen a 29% target share per game rate in his 3 games played this year. And the Colts get the Titans this week. Now, Tennessee's actually been pretty good against wide receivers this season. They rank 2nd best in the adjusted fantasy points allowed metric. But their opponents have targeted slot receivers against them pretty often. The Titans rank 1st in adjusted slot target share allowed to wide receivers this year. So that's target share to slot wide receivers adjusted for strength of opponent. That could mean a good day once again for Josh Downs because he's run 89% of his routes out of the slot this year according to PFF. Now, Romeo Doubs should be back this week after he was suspended in week 5. I don't mind him against Arizona. He's been the Packers' top wide receiver by routes run when he's been active this year. And the Cardinals are an average opponent to wide receivers on paper. This recommendation really comes down to the fact that Doubs should be running routes, and this game against Arizona is giving the Packers the 3rd best implied team total on this week's slate. Arizona has faced pretty run-heavy offenses this year in neutral game script environments. Teams are running the ball against them. But overall, I don't think this environment is that bad for Romeo Doubs, given the Packers are supposed to score a lot of points. In that same game is Michael Wilson. Green Bay struggled a bit against wide receivers to start the year, but most importantly, Wilson himself, he's getting looks in this Arizona offense. He hasn't dipped below a 21% target share in any of his last 3 games. He's seen just 2 fewer targets than Marvin Harrison Jr. during this time. In a game where Arizona might trail, Wilson's an okay enough wide receiver 4 type play. Now, Jalen Tolbert had a big game against the Steelers this past week. And without Brandon Cooks in the lineup, he ended up hitting season highs in route participation, targets per route run, and target share. If that maintains into week 6, he could be in a good spot for production. Dallas gets Detroit in a game with a 52.5 point over-under. And the Lions have been the 3rd best team for wide receivers this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now moving on to tight end, there's a handful of them this week. We'll start with our usual suspects. The guys who are running a lot of routes, who may not be the centerpieces of their offenses, but they're kind of higher end, mid-range tight end 2s each week. The first is Tyler Conklin. Cardio Conklin is now tied with Travis Kelce for the league lead in route participation. He's seen at least a 17% target share in each of his last 3 games. And the Jets get the Bills this week. While Buffalo's been really bad against running backs, they've been really good against wide receivers, and they've been really okay against tight ends. I do expect the Jets backfield duo to have a good game, but Conklin can be okay too. Cade Otton is 3rd in the NFL in tight end route participation. And like Tyler Conklin, he's been seeing more work in his offense. He's had target shares of 25%, 19%, and 17% over his last 3. And there's nothing scary about New Orleans as an opponent. The only downside, I think, is that there's less back and forth action potentially this week with Derek Carr sidelined. So the Bucs might not throw it as much. But I think Cade Otton's okay. And then I like Zach Ertz this week. In neutral game script environments, no defense has faced a higher pass rate this year than the Baltimore Ravens. So I expect Washington to throw the ball more than usual this week. That could be good for Zach Ertz. He's basically been right around the top 10 in route participation and target share at tight end this year. So I think Ertz is a decent play. And then before we move on to the deeper plays, I got to shout out Taysom Hill. Without Derek Carr, there's a chance that we see more Hill. He's just got to be healthy. And as of right now, at the time of this recording, I don't know if he is. But if he plays, he's a very intriguing tight end option. We're now looking at players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. Deep sleepers. At quarterback, we have to admit that Will Levis on paper is in a good spot. The Colts are the fourth best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed, and Levis hasn't faced a matchup this easy on paper all year. They played games against the Bears, Jets, Packers, and Dolphins. 3 of those 4 teams rank in the top 5 as most difficult matchups for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. It's no coincidence that his most usable start came against the Packers, the one team that doesn't rank as high. Basically, the Colts are the easiest matchup that Will Levis has had all year. So I'm intrigued by that. I'm intrigued by him as a deeper sleeper, as long as he plays. We've got a pair of rookies playing this week too. I prefer Drake May, given the pedigree, given the rushing upside, and there could be a negative game script for New England against Houston. Spencer Rattler, he's mostly interesting because the matchup is better on paper. He's got a better team environment around him. Now, we don't have any data on these guys, obviously. And I think that you should only go a rookie's direction when you're desperate. But they're not in terrible spots in week 6. Now, at running back in this tier, we've got to look at that Houston backfield. Joe Mixon didn't practice again on Wednesday. His status continues to be up in the air. But Dameon Pierce did. We've seen Cam Akers go from an 82% running back rush share in week 3 to a 62% one in week 4 to a 38% one in week 5. He's seeing less and less work. Dare Ogunbowale, he was the back that you wanted in their game last week. If Dameon Pierce ends up playing, he'd be my bet to see the most work on the ground for Houston. And I'd imagine Ogunbowale is more of the receiving threat. But Pierce is more interesting because this is a game against the Patriots, where the Texans will likely see a positive game script. So don't sleep on Dameon Pierce if he does return this week. That game has 2 wide receiver sleepers in it too. Jalen Polk is one of them. Polk ran a route on every New England dropback last week. He's seen back-to-back games with a 20% target share. Houston's been an above-average matchup for wide receivers this year in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed. And they've seen their wide receiver targets against them go to the perimeter more frequently than all but one team. And that's adjusted for strength of opponent. That's where Jalen Polk lines up. And then with Nico Collins out, Xavier Hutchinson should get more run for the Texans. That's at least what we saw last week. Hutchinson basically played as a starter without Collins. He finished with an 8% target share. That's not a high number, but he didn't play the full game. So if he's a starter in this offense, he needs to be on all of our radars. Now, I think the safer bet for a deeper-ish sleeper out of Vegas is Trey Tucker. Like, we can't have Jacoby Myers as a sleeper because he's rostered in way too many leagues. But I'm going to go back to my go-to matchup, and that's slot receivers against the Steelers. And with Devontae Adams out, the way the Raiders have deployed their wideouts is by having DJ Turner as their primary slot guy. Not to be confused with DJ Tanner. Over the last 2 weeks without Adams, Turner has run fewer routes than both Jacoby Myers and Trey Tucker. That's not surprising. That's why you're preferring those wide receivers. But he's seen a slot rate of 88%, and he's coming off a game where he had an 11% target share and a 76% route participation rate. This is only a deep league play. I'm talking deep, but I do think the matchup is there. Lastly, I've got one tight end in this tier. It's Chig Okonkwo. The Colts are bad defensively. They rank as the 3rd best matchup for tight ends by adjusted fantasy points allowed this year. They've also given up the 8th highest adjusted target share to the tight end position. Okonkwo saw a season-high 74% route participation the last time that we saw the Titans. That led to an 18% target share. So he's not a bad dart throw. When it comes to streaming defenses this week, I like the Chargers against the Broncos the most out of the more highly available defenses. I also think that you could look at Tampa Bay against Spencer Rattler, and then Atlanta against Carolina and Andy Dalton. Overall, though, it's a tougher week for streaming. Lastly, we got to look at some pick'ems over on Underdog. Last week, we had Trevor Lawrence going higher in his passing yards. That one hit. It's actually been a good couple of weeks with these picks. This week, I'm looking at Zach Ertz higher than 27.5 receiving yards. And then we'll go with Tyler Algier higher than half of a touchdown. So we're saying that Tyler Algier is going to score, just to ease the tilt a little bit for when Bijan Robinson doesn't get that touchdown. You guys know how that goes. You can use those if you'd like to by heading to UnderdogFantasy.com. Make sure if you're new there and you're signing up, you use promo code LATEROUND. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. As usual, tomorrow I will drop the mailbag episode, and then later in the day, you get another episode of Late Round Perspectives. I'll talk to you then.